Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a session on social welfare and corporate welfare. This is a very important topic. Everyone knows because throughout the world, because there are billions of people on this planet depending on social welfare, some form of it, directly or indirectly, they are in fact, and so are corporations. Many people uh, assume that welfare is a government program that is basically designed to take taxpayers' money and give it to people who are idle and are not interested and are parasitic, are not interested in finding a job, whether this is with regard to many European right wing political parties who argue that there are Africans and Asians coming to Europe and living off the welfare system of Europe, or whether it is in the United States with their counterparts arguing exactly the same thing about Latin Americans, for example, or other global South people. It is obviously much more complex than this. There are thousands and thousands of books on social welfare. Very few, and both books and articles, by the way, I want to make sure, scholarly as well as journalist. There's newspaper, magazine, online material as well. Um, I want to make sure that people realize that the subject of corporate welfare associated with the neoliberal model of development, which is a post-World War II model that really is institutionalized from the late 1970s to the present. This is the model uh, we're operating on now. Much of the world, one form or another, in one form or another. Obviously, some countries adhere to it much more, others less. Okay. Um, the term welfare simply means that there is a policy to provide a social safety net to a group of people. And these people um, are, in fact, in need. They have fallen through the cracks. They have fallen through the cracks. They are people who have been left behind, unable to find jobs. Usually, the victims of all of this, of the marginalized population, tend to be, according to sociological studies, women and children, by the way, on a world scale. On a world scale. So many people do not realize that it is, in fact, no matter what the mainstream media tries to portray about the lazy male sitting on a corner smoking cigarettes and collecting welfare, it's children that are the victims of this, by the way, and women. There are men, obviously, as well. Unskilled labor, the lower of the laboring classes, tends to be the biggest victims because of the unskilled element of it. And it is a global phenomenon, by the way, and it impacts both the countryside, that is the rural population, as well as the urban population on a world scale. The issue of corporate welfare is something that is much newer than social welfare. Social welfare actually goes back to the period, the first, let's call it a sort of a social welfare piece of legislation, goes back to 1601 in England, the Elizabethan Poor Law, it's called. So that's 400 years ago, 400 plus years ago. So that's a long time ago. Obviously, the institutionalized welfare system, as most people know it, is a product of the Keynesian era. In the United States, they know this as the New Deal era, from the FDR presidency in the 1930s onward to the 1970s, to the Jimmy Carter administration, when it begins, that model begins to break down, and it gives way to the neoliberal model, which is in fact in place to this day, in, like I said, in most countries in some form or another. Now, the recipients of social welfare are the masses, the lumpenproletariat, the underclass, the marginalized, the lower working class, meaning the unskilled laborers who are left behind, a lot of them women and children, by the way, and tend to be minorities, but not entirely as a lot of people think. The fact is that in Europe and in the United States especially, they want to portray that image that it's just minorities. It's immigrants and minorities sitting around collecting welfare from the generosity of the majority population. That's not true at all. The majority population is very much a part of that as well. So there is a sense of underlying xenophobia and racism embedded in the critique of the social welfare state. As far as corporate welfare, the beneficiaries, directly, of course, obviously, are banks, oil companies, retail, pharmaceutical, high tech, all the big dogs, as we say, companies that have billions in profits, and some of them market capitalization of their stock in the trillions, and yet they receive taxpayer money. So yet they have no problem accusing a welfare recipient of getting food stamps to survive for her children and herself, while they receive bailouts, as we saw in 2008, in the billions, in the hundreds of billions, corporate bailouts. Taxpayer money, by the way. They have no problem when taxpayer money goes for research and development for very profitable companies, whether it's the Silicon Valley companies or pharmaceutical companies. And then they turn around and charge exorbitant prices to the consumer, who has subsidized the research and development to begin with. No, they have no problem with that. But they do have a problem with school lunches. They do have a problem with a single mother receiving benefits to support for 3 children. That they have a problem with. Now, the stigma associated with social welfare is that social welfare is socialist. It's socialism. Why? Milton Friedman, by the way, Milton Friedman, among others, argued that how dare you take taxpayer money, how dare the state takes taxpayer money and give it to people who should be working. He had no problem. He had no problem with taxpayer money going to defense contractors and to banks and to pharmaceutical companies in the billions. No problem. Just with welfare recipients receiving money to support so they don't die in the streets, so they're not homeless in the streets. That he had a problem with. Okay. Now, here is the thesis of my discussion today, which some viewers may find curious, and others may agree with it. In my view, the crisis of capitalism in the 1930s, the Great Depression, as everyone knows it, which was global, the only country that did not suffer a Great Depression in the 1930s, as some of you may know, is the Soviet Union, because it was outside the capitalist world economy. It was communist. The rest of the world was within the domain of the capitalist world economy. So what we have is a crisis of capitalism in the 1930s. And the Keynesian system, the model of John Maynard Keynes, the economist, whose economic model the United States built the New Deal and other countries' programs like it, namely that when the private sector fails miserably as it did, and there is no choice but for the state to stimulate economic growth through employment programs that create consumer demand, that stimulate the economy and get the economy going again. If the private sector isn't there to re-stimulate the economy amid a depression, who's going to do it? There's only one entity left, the state. And if the state doesn't do it, then people die in the streets. As John Maynard Keynes pointed out in one of his sarcastic remarks, when he was told in an answer, I suppose, to this statement, is that in the long run, well, the economy will bounce back. The private sector, left to its own devices, will bounce back. And his answer was, in the long run, we'll all be dead. Okay. In other words, human beings starve now. They don't starve in the long run. They will be dead. If you let them starve now, they will be dead in the long run. So something has to be done. Now, capitalism was in crisis. So the social welfare system was a necessary tool to sustain the capitalist system, and to sustain the capitalist system under a democratic model, rather than falling into a totalitarian regime, having a revolution like the Bolshevik Russia did, like Bolshevik Russia under Lenin and Trotsky in 1917, or a Nazi regime in Germany. So the options were what? Revolution or the social welfare state. The US, France, many other countries, by the way, Chile, other countries, Mexico opted for that. And so what we have is, in fact, the crisis of capitalism creating the need for social welfare, because the recipients of social welfare, what is social welfare? Pensions, medical benefits, unemployment benefits, the special programs, everything from housing subsidies, rental, in other words, subsidies, to food subsidies, anything to put some kind of a floor, some kind of a safety net on the lower echelons of society so they can survive and not die in the streets like animals. Capitalism was in crisis through no fault of the working class. They didn't create the problems. The capitalist system fell into a crisis because the capitalism for 500 years expands and contracts, and it has long cycles of expansion and then periodic recessions and then a deep cycle of depression. 1930s was such a cycle, deep depression. Hence, social welfare to save capitalism. Keynes was not a socialist, by the way, no matter what inane critics say about Keynes. He was not a socialist. He supported the capitalist system. He believed that the capitalist system could survive, democracy could survive under this model. This actually proceeded from his time until the mid-1970s, and he then began to get into crisis. In the 1970s, there was another crisis of capitalism. And in the 1970s, the Keynesian model, the social welfare state model, was severely criticized from just about everybody, including some leftists, by the way, who argued that maybe it's time to look at something else. And what did they look at? Neoliberalism. Namely, a system which calls for the state as the pillar behind the corporate world. Neoliberalism meant transferring income from social welfare to corporate welfare. My thesis is, and there are others who have aspects of this, have argued along the same lines, or similar lines, I should say, that the social welfare as well as the corporate welfare models are actually have benefited the capitalist system. They have been the outgrowths of capitalism. Capitalism made them necessary. It made them necessary by, of course, there were choices. The elites, the political elites and the business elites had to make a choice here, and they did. But both benefited. They're not contradictory. It's not that social welfare is socialism and corporate welfare is pro-jobs, as they try to advertise it. But instead, as Senator Bernie Sanders has pointed out, corporate welfare is socialism for the rich. Corporate welfare means transferring taxpayer money in the billions, whether providing bailouts for banks, for private companies like auto companies, huge subsidies for Silicon Valley companies in the semiconductor business, for example, for the sake of competing with other companies in other countries, for whatever reasons, including national security, by the way. Defense, again, for national security reasons. Corporate welfare is welcomed. The mainstream media, the vast majority of scholars, critics, pundits, all jump on this bandwagon, supporting it, while criticizing social welfare, when in fact, both support the exact same system, capitalism. Both are there to sustain the capitalist system. They do it in a different mode. Corporate welfare necessarily entails that the money, that there is a reduction in social welfare benefits and the social safety net, in everything from unemployment benefits to raising the retirement age, to lowering the benefits for medical costs, all of that, cutting school lunches program, all of that is part of the social safety net. Transferring that money over to corporate welfare for the sake of capital accumulation. Although, as I said, both social welfare and corporate welfare ultimately benefit the capitalist system. The idea is to sustain the capitalist system. The question is, which of these models has a greater possibility of polarizing society, socially and politically, and causing greater harm to the greatest number of people, namely the underclass, the working class, those marginalized in society. This is what we're going to discuss today. I want to, since I am a historian, I want to, dealing with international political economy, I do want to tell you that before the advent of capitalism, the church in the Western world was the institution that sustained, this is where poor people, monasteries and the churches, where poor people went for support, for a plate of food if they were starving. For moral considerations, for moral reasons, the church was there. Not in all cases, but the church was there. In 1601 in England, this was codified, and it is the precursor to the modern welfare system. Contrary to what Milton Friedman argued in both his writings and as well as in his taped interviews, it is not an invention of the 19th century by the Tudors, the conservative nobility, historically linked to the landowning aristocracy that's responsible for supporting social welfare programs. It actually goes way back. It goes farther back, 400 years actually. And the reason is because the government in England recognized that people were literally starving in the streets. There was a tendency in the 16th century, before the introduction of the Poor Law of 1601, the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, to punish the poor. And this actually continued. Punishing the poor has been a universal tendency, not just in England. I'm mentioning England because of the because I mentioned this law, and it was something that was unprecedented. But the fact is, universally, there was a view that somehow the poor were associated with, how should I put it, with vice. They were lazy, they lacked ambition, they lacked intelligence, although there was no possibility for education for them. It was their fault that they were marginalized in society, not the economic system, not that they couldn't find jobs. The transition from the manorial system, the subsistence agriculture economy, to commercial agriculture, the mechanization of agriculture, by the way, created a huge surplus force, not just in England, I mentioned England, but throughout Europe and the Western world. Now, that means that there was a surplus labor force that pours into the cities, and these people tend to be unemployed. They have nowhere to go. So what are they going to do? So they are in the streets. They're homeless. They're starving. They're roaming. They're stealing. So what we have is the attitude that it's their fault. That why are they in the streets? Why are they working? Because there are no jobs. In the 19th century, two great thinkers in different areas, again, English. One was Charles Dickens through his novels in the mid-19th century, and the other was Henry Mayhew, a journalist, wrote extensively about the surplus labor force that was marginalized, and how instead of the state or any private institutions providing any kind of a safety net for them, there was a tendency to punish these people, to accuse them of being responsible for their own fate rather than the mode of production, rather than the structure, the social contract. Henry Mayhew's work, London Labor and the London Poor, looks at just about everybody in London, from unskilled workers to beggars and thieves and prostitutes, the lumpen proletariat of society, the underclass that the Industrial Revolution has created. And it has thrown them out there in society and has left them to their own devices. And then the people looking at them from the middle class and the aristocracy, although Friedman was right, some in the aristocracy, the Tudors, the conservative, ironically, by the way, they were conservative, look at this and they go, okay, we have to do something about these people. We have to provide a social safety net for these people. The tendency was to castigate them, to blame them for their own fate, including children, by the way. This is what Charles Dickens, in his genius, brings out in his novels, that the institutional network, government and private sector alike, look at even children who are poor with suspicion. They're evil. There's something wrong with them not working. So they did have institutions for them, poorhouses, as they were called, as well as prisons, by the way, so that they were confined. So what we have is a situation where historically there is, by the elites, deep suspicion of the poverty that's created by the economic system, by capitalism, and then turning around and wanting to punish the victims of the system, namely the lower echelons of the working class, who are unable to find jobs, including children, by the way. Want to make sure, including children, punish them. Um, Now, the in the late 19th century, there was a tendency by progressives, progressive liberals, Democrats, as well as trade unionists, women's organizations, and anarchists, syndicalists, socialists, to argue that the responsibility to take care of these people who are marginalized in society belongs with the state. So there were outcries for a social welfare state. Ironically, by the way, the German working class really pushed on this issue, and ironically, the conservative chancellor of Germany, who unified Germany, a Prussian conservative, a Junker, which means an aristocrat from the Prussian landowning aristocracy, Otto von Bismarck, who unified Germany in 1870, becomes the first to introduce the modern social security system, the modern social. He lays out the perimeters for the a modern social welfare state, and he did not do it. He was a militarist. He was a conservative, pro-capital. Why did he do it? He did not do it for the sake of the working class, because he felt sorry for any moral considerations. He did it because he recognized that these people, namely the workers of Germany, constituted the majority, hence a threat to the political and social status quo. So he had to appease them, he had to buy them, to co-opt them. So he offers them, he disarmed them by giving them, making social concessions to them. Okay? FDR did the same thing. The British did the same thing in the late 30s, early 40s, actually, under William Beveridge. So the world begins to recognize, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution puts the fear in the West during the Great Depression, not in the 1920s, by the way, but during the Great Depression, that they must in fact adopt a social welfare state, because workers look at the Bolshevik revolution and they will want to emulate it and bring down capitalism. To save capitalism, why not a social welfare state, which preserves capitalism, gives some crumbs to the working class? You have social peace, political stability, and the elites retain their privileged roles in society. And still, the business sector is stimulated because of social welfare programs, exactly as John Maynard Keynes argued, by the way. And this is what I meant earlier when I said capitalism goes in crisis in the 1930s and necessitates some kind of a system that preserves the economic model, capitalism, the mode of production of capitalism, as well as democracy, instead of falling into some kind of a totalitarian system like Nazi Germany. Okay. Now, when the war ended, when World War II ended, we see the beginning of the dismantling of the social welfare state, because we see it with the creation of the Bretton Woods system in the United States, by the way, the creation of the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. These two institutions, wherever they went to make loans, the IMF made monetary stabilization loans. In other words, when a country had a balance of payments deficit, they had a trade deficit, they needed the money, they needed foreign capital. They couldn't borrow in the open market, so they borrowed from the International Monetary Fund on conditions. The conditions were reduce the social welfare state, strengthen the private sector, reduce tariffs, invite foreign capital in. This is the precursor to the neoliberal model. So we have from the 1940s until the 1970s, the IMF and the World Bank, by the way, just briefly provided development loans for large projects like electrification projects, steel plant projects, so forth, agricultural development projects. So these twin banks, these sister institutions, headquartered, by the way, in Washington, D.C., were there influencing policy on a world scale because they had money to provide to governments who needed the money to stabilize their currencies, okay, and to go on with development projects. So they lay the groundwork before the full-fledged neoliberal model takes place in the 1970s in Chile under Augusto Pinochet, with the guidance of the United States and people like Milton Friedman and the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. And then England in the 1970s under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan. The 1970s there was a crisis in the 1970s. The combination of the energy crisis of the 1970s, the loss of the Vietnam War by the United States, the Iranian Revolution 1979, the Nicaraguan Revolution in 1979, the convergence of these crises coming at a time that Europe's economic health and Japan's, and to a lesser degree Taiwan and South Korea, was rising relative to the United States, which was realizing huge balance of payments deficits, by the way, partly because of immense defense spending and costs related to Vietnam, partly because of that. There's a crisis of capitalism again. And what that is the solution to the crisis of capitalism? And this is the United States, the world's #1 economy in the 1970s. The world's #1 economy is in crisis. So what's the solution? Neoliberalism, which brings about corporate welfare. So the crisis of capitalism in the 1930s brings about social welfare. The crisis of capitalism in the 1970s brings about corporate welfare. Reagan and Thatcher, first Thatcher, then Reagan, begin a massive scaling down of social welfare programs. They attack government. And people actually bought this. They attack government, although if you now, looking back more than 40 years, when you study this from a scholarly perspective, you see that the role of the state actually rises. It's not reduced, it goes up. And debt, they argued against debt. Social welfare creates debt. Actually, under social welfare, there was a lot less debt. Under corporate welfare, massive debt. As anyone can see, all they have to do is go to the statistics of the history of debt for the United States, Great Britain, European countries, Japan, which has the largest debt in the world, by the way. So all you have to do is look at the statistics. You don't have to take my word for it. So what you have is this attack on the welfare state, and they don't call it the welfare state. They attack on government. Government is too big. Although what they really were talking about is that the role of government must now shift from a focus of indirectly supporting the capitalist system through social welfare programs to directly providing corporate subsidies, tax breaks, bailouts for banks and auto companies, provide at all levels, by the way, at all levels. Let me just give you some examples. Let's take a large company. I won't mention the company. I can mention another company. I won't mention. Take any company, a multinational corporation. They go to country X, and they go, well, this is a good location for us to set up a factory or to set up a warehouse or a retail operation. The city actually welcomes that. They say, of course, okay, for us to do that, you have to give us $100 million or $500 million or X. Plus, you have to defer taxes for the next 10 years for us. Corporate taxes. That's corporate welfare. This is not theoretical. This is exactly what they have been doing. Then you have billionaires who go to countries and they say, well, you have to give me, I want to develop resort hotels and a marina next to the resort hotels. You have to give me all the real estate to do that. The state, the government has to give it to them. This is not a theoretical example. I'm talking about the country I'm in right now, where this actually happened here. And you have to give me the land, develop the infrastructure for this land. You have to pay to develop the infrastructure, the sewage system, roads, and so forth. You have to develop that, bridges, okay? You have to pay some additional costs related to the development of this land for me to develop this land. You have to defer my taxes X number of years, and then I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll borrow money from your banks at preferred rate. You guarantee the loans, and then I'll invest. In other words, this is why Senator Sanders, in Senate committee hearings, has been arguing, also, by the way, in speeches that he gives around. This is socialism for the rich. They're saying, give me public money for private use. These same people find it appalling that a child is receiving a school lunch, a child from a poor family, whether minority or non-minority, it doesn't matter. These same people are upset. How can this mother of 4 children be on welfare? She's on welfare because the company she works for is not paying her enough. And again, I am hesitant to mention the company, but Senator, again, I'm going to go back to Senator Sanders. Senator Sanders recently held a Senate committee hearing for a specific company. I won't mention it. And he argued that corporate subsidy is actually not the only direct subsidy these companies get. They also get a subsidy through social welfare programs. Let me explain what he laid out. This is very important. And the reason I'm doing this is because my thesis today is that social welfare and corporate welfare are interrelated. Okay. He pointed out that when a company is not paying its employees a living wage, then the government has to kick in Medicaid. Those of you who are not familiar, who are outside the United States, Medicaid is a program for people who are below a certain level, poverty in other words, and qualify for medical assistance 100%. Rent subsidy, other programs that are designed to help people below the poverty line. So the senator's point was, wait a minute, the social welfare program is really benefiting you because the taxpayer is now subsidizing you because you're not paying the wage, the living wage for that worker, so that the worker isn't forced to go on welfare, isn't forced to supplement their income with these social welfare programs. So this is what I meant at the outset when I said that corporate welfare and social welfare are interrelated. Social welfare is really a conduit. It's a conduit. Think of it as a conduit to support business. And they know this. They deliberately pay. For example, in California. California is very high cost of living area, the whole state. They know that federal minimum wage is well below the poverty line, well below the poverty line. They know that their workers, the workers of the companies that pay the federal minimum wage within the law, they know that that means that their workers are subsidized by the taxpayer, which means the company is receiving a subsidy that they instead, because they're not paying their workers the wages for them to survive on, you see. And then they have the audacity to complain about the social welfare program, which is a distraction, by the way, because they're the beneficiaries of all this. They are the beneficiaries of all this. So and even worse than that, the media, pundits, right and left, university professors. Unfortunately, I worked with a number of them who argued along these lines. Wall Street experts, they all say the same thing. Oh, yes. We have a huge debt, and the problem is the welfare system. Never mind corporate welfare, as well as social welfare, which drains resources to support the capitalist system, which capitalist system means that within society, a tiny percentage of the population derives the lion's share of wealth and income. So the myth that somehow, and it's a myth of distraction and public relations. And politicians, by the way, they go on and have debates about this as though this is a real issue. The real issue here is the same capitalist class that benefits from corporate welfare benefits from social welfare, except that in social welfare, in corporate welfare, you don't have any derivative benefits to the underclass, to the working class, to the lower echelons of the working class. In social welfare, you do, because the money is filtered through them. At least they're not starving in the streets. And you don't have the situation that you had in England in the 16th century, where they literally beat people who were unemployed, who were roaming the streets. They beat them up and chased them back to their to the origin of their wherever they came from, their villages, of their towns. I want to point out that another issue, another dimension here, which is very important. This issue came up in the decade of the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president of the United States and Tony Blair was prime minister in England. And both of them neoliberals, by the way, because neoliberalism is not, it is not an economic model that is somehow the monopoly of the right wing. No. The center and the center left have also embraced it the last 45 years. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton presented himself as some kind of a liberal, okay, on social issues, cultural, lifestyle issues, okay. That's it. He was as committed to neoliberalism, if not more, than Reagan and Bush. And Tony Blair, even more so. In the 1990s, what happens is welfare to work, the catchy terms which they use in the media, which is sort of nauseating. But the idea was, well, transition. You don't want to be dependent. You don't want to be a welfare mother. You don't want to be this individual identified with a food stamp program and receiving unemployment benefits and so forth. You want a job, even if it's minimum wage. Take the job. The question is, of course, how do you survive on minimum wage if it's below poverty? That's obviously another issue. But here's what happened in the 1990s. It became very clear in neoliberal governments. I only mentioned the United States and Britain because they were the prototypes, by the way, globally disseminate, spreading neoliberalism on a world scale. But they pushed this really hard. It is important to understand that when you get people off welfare and throw them into the workforce, you create a surplus labor pool. When you create a surplus labor pool, you drive down wages even more. By the 1990s, many of the Western countries, including the United States and Great Britain, were beginning to move out of they were beginning to offshore their manufacturing. In the case of the United States, of course, the maquiladora plants, the factories down on the border, along the border of Mexico and Texas, but also beginning to move to China. China was opening up. So you have in the 1990s the exodus of industries from Western countries into the global South. Okay, and that in itself creates a surplus labor force. On top of that, they bring as many people, they get as many people out of welfare roles into the labor force, the active labor force. So they create an even greater labor force and puts wage pressure downward. So when you look at statistics, what you see in the 1980s, 1990s, but this continues, unfortunately, because in 2008, there was a crisis, the Great Recession. You see continued downward pressure on wages. This continued downward pressure on wages, okay, benefited companies. The question is, what did they do with all of this? Well, this was in the 1980s and 1990s. In 2008, there was another major crisis of capitalism, the Great Recession, which was global. And again, corporate welfare, trillions, not billions, trillions globally spent to bail out corporations, banks, and insurance companies, and all kinds of companies, raiding pension funds in many countries around the world. Okay, people finding out that their unemployment benefits and their pension checks are going to be reduced. So you have corporate welfare lowering living standards in the post 2008 crisis. So corporate welfare devastated society in the post 2008 era. So we have historically corporate welfare contributing massively to downward social mobility. It also meant keeping minimum wage across the world, by the way, at low levels. Very few countries brought wages up. The Scandinavian countries, China and the Scandinavian countries remain the exception. From Japan to the United States, Canada to Europe and the global south, you have downward pressure, reduction of social welfare, and simultaneously downward pressure on wages. And what the result has been, and I will conclude this with this because we're coming up on the hour, is voters looking for solutions. And where do they find solutions? They find solutions, unfortunately, in right-wing populists who are actually neoliberal, whether in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, or in the United States, people like Trump. Populist neoliberals. But because they're populist, they're hiding behind the populist rhetoric, but somehow they're the messiah of the masses, and they will save the masses from the elites, although they represent the elites. These populists represent the exact same elites. Now, on a more subtle point, neoliberalism is in crisis. There are scholars who point out that neoliberalism is over, that in fact it was over with 2008. There are others who argue, well, if it wasn't over in 2008, it certainly was over by the time that COVID-19 hit 4 years ago, in 2020. No matter how you slice it, by the way, neoliberalism has been diluted. When you have the leading countries, the United States, Germany, France, Great Britain, and Japan, those five, looking at strengthening their economic role on a world scale, because they see China as a threat and reverting to schemes of economic sanctions and tariffs, that it goes against neoliberalism's principles of free trade and free investment, free flow of capital, and the system itself, the point here is that the system itself has created contradictions. It's swimming in its own contradictions. And the question is, where is social welfare and corporate welfare going here? In my view, as more and more countries are slipping toward authoritarianism under the thin veil of democracy, and I mean very thin, because behind that veil, there are authoritarian policies, by the way. Macron will be running against Marine Le Pen. Macron is supposed to be a liberal, pluralist, neoliberal. Marine Le Pen, a neo-fascist, neoliberal, populist. Marine Le Pen, in fact, may win. There is also the election in the United States. The election in the United States between Trump and Biden. The question is, how much difference is there in between these two neoliberals? Both followed, both in the record, they were both presidents. Their record is very clear that they supported the neoliberal model, corporate welfare. Both of them, no matter the rhetoric, they both supported corporate welfare. And they both imposed restrictive conditions on constitutional rights. So the thin veil of democracy is getting thinner, and authoritarianism is creeping through. So as the elites perceive that the pressure for sustaining their privileged role in society and sustaining capital accumulation so that they don't lose that privileged role, as that pressure mounts, there are signs now, not in the future, it's not that I have to predict anything, right now, that indicate there is considerable predisposition toward authoritarianism on the part of the elites, that they would rather have that and set aside a lot of the democratic rights, although they will continue calling themselves a democracy and so forth. It doesn't matter. The label doesn't matter. The reality is what the policy impact is on human beings. And the policy impact is going to be, because it has been in the last few years, it will continue to get worse. It has been and it will get worse. Increasing polarization. And I had a session on polarization of society in another video. Polarization will continue. And as polarization continues, the corporate welfare system will get stronger and the social welfare system will get weaker. And remember, this is not a choice. This is not social welfare, socialism, corporate welfare, good progress for business. It's not that at all. They are both systems designed through different mechanisms of social engineering to support capitalism. I thank you for your attention. I invite your comments. I invite you, by the way, to become members of this channel and to leave comments and anything you like, agree or disagree. I love to read your comments and I will definitely respond. I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.